Before the sun rises, London's bakers are already feeding the first bundles of firewood into their ovens. Rows of dough sit across long wooden tables. Apprentices carry the risen loaves toward the oven mouth. The fire cannot be too weak, or the bread will remain raw inside. It cannot be too strong either. If the crust burns, an entire batch may lose its value. Several hours later, the streets begin to wake. People arrive at the bakery carrying a farthing, a halfpenny, or a penny to purchase one of the most important foods of the day. If heavy rain has damaged the roads and reduced the amount of wheat entering London, the grain purchased by the baker that morning might cost twice as much as it did the previous week. In a modern shop, rising ingredient costs usually lead to higher prices. A medieval London baker could not simply turn a farthing loaf into a halfpenny loaf. The coin normally remained the same. What changed was the amount of bread the customer received. When wheat became more expensive, the loaf became lighter. When wheat became cheaper, the loaf became heavier. On the 18th of July, 1476, a London baker named William Hubert was brought before the city authorities. The bread he had been selling did not meet the legally required weight. The mayor and aldermen sentenced him to stand in the pillory. The surviving record does not tell us how much Hubert had paid for wheat that morning. It does not preserve the complete cost of his fuel, labor, rent, or equipment. It records only the final commercial result. His bread was too light. In medieval London, that was more than an ordinary customer complaint. It was an offense against the city's food order. During the same year, London's bakers presented new regulations to the mayor and aldermen. They proposed that the trade should inspect bread at least twice each week and report underweight loaves to the mayor. Hubert, therefore, faced more than the occasional visit of a market official. His fellow bakers, his trade organization, and the city government could all examine his bread. Why would a city devote so much time and authority to weighing a loaf? For medieval urban residents, bread was not an ordinary product that could simply be abandoned when the price became inconvenient. Grain may have supplied as much as 4/5 of the calories consumed by agricultural laborers in the early 14th century. Different social groups ate different grains and different qualities of bread, but cereals remained the foundation of the English diet. Bread was one of their most important forms. A customer could drink less wine. He could postpone buying new shoes. He could not stop buying food for long. That made the price of bread a matter of public order. When grain prices increased, the baker saw higher costs. City officials saw the street. If low-income residents discovered that the same coin suddenly bought only half as much food, the dispute outside a bakery could quickly become more than a disagreement between a merchant and a customer. During the English food disturbances of 1347, angry crowds connected the weight of bread, the sale of grain, and the conduct of market traders. An underweight loaf could become evidence that the entire market was unfair. Medieval England therefore developed a regulatory system commonly known as the Assize of Bread and Ale. Its mature written form is usually associated with the 1260s, although the market practices behind it were older. The system did not simply declare that every loaf must always be sold at exactly the same price. Instead, it created a sliding relationship between the market price of wheat and the legal weight of bread. Market officials first examined the recent prices of high-quality, ordinary, and lower-quality wheat. Using those prices, they calculated how much bread of each grade should weigh. Officials could collect weights, measures, and sample loaves from around the city. Bread might also carry the baker's personal mark, allowing inspectors to identify the shop that had produced an underweight loaf. When wheat moved into a higher price range, bakers were legally permitted to make lighter bread. But until the city formally adjusted the standard, an individual baker could not decide for himself how much dough to remove. At first, this system appears strange. Why not allow the price of bread to rise directly? One reason was that bread was commonly sold at a few small and familiar retail prices. Customers understood the farthing loaf, the halfpenny loaf, and the penny loaf. The farthing loaf was particularly important to the poorest buyers because a farthing might be the only coin available to them. If bakers continually adjusted prices into awkward fractions whenever grain costs changed, everyday transactions would become more difficult. The city would also find it harder to compare bread sold by different shops. Keeping the price stable while changing the weight made enforcement relatively simple. An official could place the loaf on a scale and immediately see whether the baker had followed the standard. The customer did not need to understand the grain market. He only needed to know how much bread his farthing was legally supposed to purchase that day. From the baker's side, however, bread did not appear automatically when flour was mixed with water. The grain had to be purchased. It had to be carried to a mill and converted into flour. The flour had to be sifted. The more thoroughly it was sifted, the more bran was removed and the less fine white flour remained. The baker also needed salt, yeast, or brewing residue for fermentation, candles, firewood, bowls, cloths, sieves, tools, and labor. The oven had to be heated in advance. Even if only half a batch was baked, the amount of wood required to bring the brick oven up to working temperature did not fall by half. Bread also lost moisture as it baked, because a piece of dough might appear heavy enough when it entered the oven, but weigh considerably less after baking and cooling when the official finally placed it on the scale. The baker therefore had to decide how much raw dough to use before he knew the final weight of the loaf. Adding extra dough protected him against punishment, but it also transferred part of his margin directly to the customer. Removing a little dough might increase the return from a batch, but it created the risk of confiscation, fines, and public humiliation. Early versions of the legal calculation attempted to place the baker's production costs directly inside the formula. One historical version of the English bread standard allowed a baker 3 pence from each quarter of wheat for his labor and gain, while also allowing him to retain the bran removed during sifting. Separate allowances were made for the oven, servants, a boy, salt, yeast, candles, fuel, and the cloths or sieves used to process the flour. The people who created the regulation did not believe that bakers should work without compensation. They tried to leave room for the grain, the production costs, and the baker's own return. The problem was that these were standard costs written into a regulatory table. Real prices for wood, wages, milling, flour yields, and wastage did not remain fixed simply because the table said they should. When a baker purchased wheat at the expected price, filled the oven efficiently, found that fuel had not become more expensive, and sold every loaf, the system could leave him with a reasonable return. But the real grain might contain excess moisture or impurities. It might produce less usable flour than the official formula assumed. Firewood might suddenly become more expensive while the legal bread weight continued to reflect an older fuel cost. A spoiled batch could not be recovered by raising the price of the next one. The retail price was already controlled. The baker's remaining choices were limited. He could sell more bread, he could purchase cheaper grain, he could reduce waste, or he could allow each loaf to become slightly lighter. That was the temptation present in almost every bakery before William Hubert was placed in the pillory. London bread was not a single, uniform product. The finest white loaves required flour that had been sifted more thoroughly, removing a greater quantity of bran. Wastel bread stood near the high-quality end of the market. Cocket bread was somewhat coarser. Darker wholemeal loaves, mixed grain breads, and other rougher products retained more of the original grain and created less waste. Each grade had its own legal weight. In 1304, London records listed 32 bakers producing brown bread and 21 producing white bread. By the 15th century, the balance had reversed, and white bread bakers had become more numerous. The whiter the flour, the more bran had to be removed. The customer paid for whiteness, refinement, and social status. The baker had to manage the extraction rate. This gave the baker a product mix. Coarser bread used more of the grain and appealed to customers concerned primarily with price and quantity. White bread could offer a more attractive return per loaf, particularly in the halfpenny and penny sizes. The most troublesome product was often the farthing loaf. It still had to be divided, shaped, handled, baked, and sold, but each individual loaf generated very little revenue. One large loaf and 4 small ones might contain nearly the same quantity of flour. The large loaf required only one piece to be shaped and handled. Historical records show city authorities insisting that bakers continue producing farthing loaves for residents with the least purchasing power. Bakers often preferred the larger halfpenny and penny white loaves because the smallest loaves required more labor and produced lower returns. Farthing coins could also be scarce. Some small loaves may even have been sold on credit. The customer ate the bread immediately. The baker waited to receive the coin. The fact that bakers could not freely raise prices did not mean that the city controlled every part of their earnings. They still decided which types of bread to produce. They could choose white bread or coarse bread. They could emphasize larger or smaller loaves. They could sell directly from the shop or supply street retailers. They could purchase cheaper wheat or improve the control of fermentation, oven temperature, and dough division. A skilled baker did more than transform dough into bread. He repeatedly placed each loaf as close as possible to the legal minimum without falling below it. A tiny extra piece of dough given to one customer meant almost nothing. Repeated across thousands of loaves, it could consume the bakery's entire annual surplus. Regulators understood the same calculation. Oxford required individual marks on bakers' loaves as early as 1254. In some towns, market officials placed sample loaves before a jury of local residents and weighed them publicly. Legal text allowed smaller or first offenses to be punished through fines. A serious or repeated offender who refused to correct his behavior could be sent to the pillory. A royal charter granted to Bristol by Edward III in 1347 explicitly confirmed the city's power to punish those who violated the bread standard. The surviving decorated charter even shows an offending baker being dragged through the streets. Underweight loaves hang around his neck, while the dishonest scales associated with the offense appear above him. The purpose of such punishment was not merely to embarrass one businessman. A bakery depended on repeat customers. The same residents returned to the same street every morning. When they saw a baker paraded with his own underweight loaves hanging from his neck, the loss extended beyond the confiscated batch. His reputation was being weighed in public as well. Strict regulation could also collide with the realities of operating the business. In 1468, 3 bakers in Hingham, Norfolk, refused to present their bread for weighing. The surviving record describes a collective resistance to inspection, including a direct dispute between one baker and a market official. The bakers were not necessarily declaring that they had a right to cheat customers. Frequent inspections, demanding standards, and high penalties may have convinced the trade that regulation had moved beyond what the business could reasonably bear. Modern historical research has also found that the assize of bread did not always provide bakers with a perfectly stable return. In principle, the system linked the price of wheat to the legal weight of bread and attempted to preserve a reasonable but limited profit. The calculation, however, contained structural weaknesses. Within some price ranges, cheap grain could make it difficult for the baker to cover actual costs. At higher grain prices, the legal formula could sometimes provide more generous room for earnings. Rising wheat prices did not automatically make every baker poorer. Bread became lighter according to the rules, and the legal allowance available to the operator could also change. The most dangerous situation arose when real purchasing and production costs had moved. But the official weight table, we can now follow 1/4 of wheat into a representative 15th century London bakery. This is not a surviving annual financial statement from William Hubert. We do not possess his rent, daily sales, firewood purchases, or household wage records. The following model simply uses the cost structure found in historical bread regulations to show how money moved through the business. Suppose 1/4 of wheat sells in the market for 6 shillings, or 72 pence. The baker first pays 72 pence and receives the grain. The wheat is carried to a mill, ground and sifted. Part becomes flour suitable for different grades of bread. Part becomes bran. A smaller amount remains in sacks, milling equipment, sieves, and the spaces through which it has passed. The bran is not worthless waste. It can be sold, used in coarser foods, or fed to animals. That is why early legal standards deliberately allowed the baker to keep the bran as part of his return. When the flour reaches the bakery, the operator must pay for the labor of servants and apprentices. He adds salt and fermentation material. Candles burn while the dough is prepared during the night. Firewood heats the oven. One early calculation placed these production items and the baker's own allowance at roughly 10 pence in identified cash costs and earnings, in addition to the bran and certain small returns retained in bread. The exact figures differed across periods and towns, but the sequence remained similar. 72 pence purchased the wheat. The remaining revenue had to cover labor, fuel, tools, and the baker's compensation. The finished bread was then divided into large numbers of farthing, halfpenny, and penny loaves. The higher the grain price, the lighter each legal loaf became. The baker had to sell more individual loaves from the 1/4 of wheat to recover the cost of the grain and the permitted production expenses. This is where the misunderstanding becomes most visible. The customer saw the loaf become lighter and concluded that the baker was deliberately giving him less food. The baker saw that a 1/4 of wheat had become more expensive while the value of the coin remained unchanged. The city official stood between them. If the bread was too heavy, the baker might be unable to remain in business. If it was too light, customers would believe that the market was exploiting their hunger. The purpose was not simply to force the lowest possible price. The system was attempting to calculate how much profit a baker should be allowed to earn. We can place the same representative bakery into 3 different years. The model uses one simple historical allowance, approximately 4 pence of operator earnings for every 1/4 of wheat processed, with bran and other permitted items treated separately. Those 4 pence are not a complete modern net profit. Shop rent, some repairs, unpaid debts, household labor, and additional local expenses might still have to be covered. The figure only allows us to see how sales volume expands or compresses the final result. In a strong year, the wheat supply is stable. London's population and market activity remain high. The bakery processes 300 quarters of wheat. The oven operates close to capacity for much of the year. The heat created by each firing is spread across a larger quantity of bread. The baker can sell more profitable halfpenny and penny white loaves while still producing the smaller bread required by the authorities. At 4 pence per 1/4, the formal operator's allowance reaches 1,200 pence, or £5, in addition to the value of the bran and other small permitted returns. This does not immediately transform the baker into a great city merchant. But with moderate rent, no major fines, and sufficient household labor, it can fund new tools, additional wheat purchases, or the accumulation of inventory when grain prices are favorable. In an ordinary year, the bakery processes 220 quarters. Customers still enter every day. The oven is frequently used, but not every firing is full. Farthing loaves form a larger share of production. Some bread supplied to retailers does not immediately produce cash. At the same 4 pence allowance, the operator's return is 880 pence, or £3, 13 shillings, and 4 pence in addition to the bran. This amount still includes payment for the management, night work, and risk carried by the baker's household. One repair to the oven wall, several unsold batches, or a retailer who fails to pay can reduce the remaining amount sharply. The street sees a stable and busy bakery. The account book shows an income sustained largely by family labor. In a weak year, repeated rainfall damages the harvest and disrupts transport. The baker can obtain only 160 quarters of wheat. Demand for bread does not disappear. It may become more urgent, but grain is scarcer, purchasing is more difficult, and official scrutiny becomes more intense. The harvest failures of 1315 and 1316 pushed English grain prices to unprecedented levels. During such crises, the weight of bread and the conduct of the grain market became matters of even greater political concern. Processing 160 quarters at an allowance of 4 pence each produces only 640 pence, or £2. The shop and oven have not become smaller. The baker must still maintain apprentices and household labor. Firewood may also become more expensive because the same damaged roads are disrupting its supply. If the legal weight fails to reflect his real costs quickly enough, one batch can move from a narrow gain into a loss. If he makes the loaves slightly lighter, inspectors can confiscate them and impose a fine. If the offense is repeated or considered serious, he can be sent to the pillory like William Hubert. The greatest danger in a weak year is that the more urgently customers need bread, the less able the baker is to withdraw from the market. He cannot behave like a luxury merchant and close the shop until prices improve. The city needs the ovens to remain active. Residents may interpret a refusal to bake as hoarding, speculation, or the abandonment of a public duty. The medieval bakery therefore occupied a peculiar position. It was a privately operated business expected to perform a public service. The baker purchased his own grain. He paid for his own fuel and labor. He carried the risk of spoiled batches, unsold bread, and customer debts. But he could not completely determine his own prices, sizes, or product mix according to those costs. The city allowed him a reasonable return. It did not allow him to convert a shortage into an unlimited price increase. This helps explain why most bakers did not automatically become wealthy simply because they controlled the production of a daily necessity. Research into English urban baking suggests that professional bakers often possessed relatively limited assets. Those who accumulated greater wealth usually moved beyond the final stage of production, at the oven. They entered the grain trade. They purchased wheat in advance. They controlled milling, transport, ovens, or retail distribution. They might own buildings and baking facilities that could be leased to other operators. Bakers involved in large-scale grain commerce could acquire substantial wealth. Those who relied only on regulated retail bread sales faced much narrower opportunities. This reveals the most important division within the bread business. An ordinary baker purchased wheat after its price had already risen and then sold bread at a weight determined by the city. A grain merchant holding inventory could buy cheaply after a good harvest and sell to bakers during a shortage. A mill owner earned a charge whenever wheat was ground. A landlord who owned the oven or shop could collect rent without needing a single piece of dough. The stage most heavily regulated was often the final one closest to the consumer. The person blamed by the customer was the baker. The more stable returns may already have been taken by the landowner, grain merchant, miller, and property owner. The record of William Hubert does not explain why he sold underweight bread. Perhaps he deliberately reduced the loaves to increase his earnings. Perhaps the dough contained too much water and lost more weight during baking than he expected. None of those explanations appears in the judgment. The city examined the final loaf. It was legally required to meet a certain weight. It did not. So why could a medieval bakery not simply raise its prices? Because bread was not treated as an ordinary product belonging entirely to the person who sold it. It was the daily foundation of urban survival. It was also one of the measures by which residents judged whether the market itself was fair. Officials allowed the cost of wheat to change the weight of bread. They did not allow the baker to transform hunger directly into an unlimited selling price. In a good harvest year, the baker earned money through stable purchasing, full ovens, and the sale of higher quality white loaves. In an ordinary year, much of his apparent profit represented the night labor of his entire household. In a year of scarcity, the legal loaf became lighter, yet grain prices, fuel costs, fixed expenses, and strict inspection could still squeeze the operator from every side. The people who became truly wealthy usually did not remain only in front of the oven. They attempted to control grain, mills, buildings, inventory, or distribution, allowing them to earn money before the bread entered the fire. At dawn, a customer places a farthing on the counter. He believes he is buying a loaf of bread. The city official is weighing something larger: the price of grain, the baker's permitted income, and the fragile balance of order in the streets. On the surface, the bakery sells flour shaped by fire. What it truly carries is the responsibility of convincing an entire city that rising grain prices have not allowed hunger itself to become a form of fraud.